Lesson 2. Standardizing the improvement. In this lesson, we will discuss the following ideas. First, we need to understand the nature of work standards, practice, and procedure, develop the habit of using standard work, and then applying standard work to the functions of a leader by looking at daily reflections, doing Gemba walks, and mentoring your future leaders. After pursuing a series of experiments, we are now able to identify with more confidence the right processes and the right practices that should be in place. These improved processes should be sustained, and in order to do this, we need to apply the concept of standard work. Standard work is not about standardizing the process, but more importantly, being able to develop the leaders and the people who run the process to be able to maintain and sustain it moving forward. In order to sustain the improvements we've done, we need to find a way by which we can preserve these practices that makes the improvement better than before. To be able to understand standardization, we need to understand the nature of what we mean by coming up with work standards, practice, and procedures. Oftentimes, when we hear the word standardization, we often equate it to some written document containing a process flowchart, the specifications of the product or the process, including work instructions that detail the activities and the tasks that should be performed in the right sequence. It can also be expressed in the form of an electronic format or be it in a digital file that's actually accessible via the cloud. And this can be the foundation for your trainings later on when you now involve other people who are new to the process. At the core of this standardization concept, we believe that nothing happens on a reliable, sustained basis unless we build the system to cause it to happen on a reliable and sustained basis. Standardization helps us ensure that we meet the quality that we wanted consistently and reliably every time. The benefits of standardizing work would be as follows. It produces better reliability on our products and services. It can reduce cost because we can avoid waste. It can also improve our employee performance because they're producing better results for us and for our customers. It can also lead to better safety practices. It helps our process to be consistent and in control, and it can open up opportunities for continuous improvement because we can see opportunities by which we can change the standards or the practices that we have right now. In general, by doing this standardizing of work, we get to be able to see how we can best address the needs of our customers by making sure we do the practice consistently. When we talk about standardization, it is often equated to some sort of practice or procedure or instruction. By definition, it is often a written agreement between the person doing the work and the organization where the job is being asked. In general, when we talk about the standard practice, the purpose is to be able to gather and document and capture the right technology, the right process that is needed in order to do the work in the form of a written document so that it is easier for others to learn and know more about that work. This can contain written experiences or guidelines from people who have done the work. It can include specific job instructions at the detailed task of the person doing the work. It can also include possible variations that's needed, or it can also contain priorities that would allow the person executing the work be able to determine what should be done first. One of the more common questions when we try to standardize our process is the level of detail that's needed in order to provide sufficient instruction for the person to do the work properly. Levels of detail can be as high level, where it describes the process of work that you do. It can go to the mid-level, where you can describe the activities, or it can be at the task level, where it defines the step-by-step activity. Having these standard practices helps us reduce any variation that may come from a work that's being done by different people or groups. It can also provide the reason of why we do certain tasks this way for operators and managers to know the job better. It can also be the basis for providing trainings to new people and also for identifying possible deviations that may have happened by referring to our standard practices. It is also a means to capture and retain the knowledge of our people, especially those experts with years of experiences, to become part of our standard practices. And finally, it can also give us directions in the case of exceptions or unusual conditions that may happen from time to time. It is quite common for organizations to actually have documented standards or work processes. Unfortunately, many of them, even though with the presence of these work standards, encounter challenges in sustaining and ensuring the consistency of the output of their processes. Typical pitfalls of having these documented work standards could be as follows. 1. People often forget that they are available and that they're not sometimes as accessible as we would like to be. Oftentimes, you get to have these documented standards quite out of the reach of the persons who actually would need them. There are also some items in the work standards that are more theoretical or ideal and thus doesn't seem to match what is actually happening. Sometimes it can also provide a case where these processes have been written by someone else are not properly tested or verified. It is also not clear when we talk about what results are we expecting to get and in what form. Sometimes we have documented procedures that are quite vague, such as checking for errors or ensuring that they're correct. It doesn't really explain well how do you know that they are correct. Finally, it's also important to make sure that our documented standards are updated and that we should learn to let go of the old standards in order to pursue new standards. In essence, when we apply standardization on the improvements that we have learned along the way, we are securing these improvements and will serve as the foundation of future improvements of our process. Standardization, as the diagram shows in the left, helps us make sure that we don't backslide or go back to where we are. By having these standards in our processes in place, we get to make sure that we keep on moving forward and not go back to where we started. In order to make sure that the standards that we've identified will truly give benefits to the organization, to our people, we need to make sure that they become part of the habit of doing the work. One way to understand the importance of this habit is to be able to distinguish how we see standards. Oftentimes, when we talk about standards or standardization, we talk about defining the requirements, defining the process, and making sure that we all understand what the requirements are. We also come up with work instructions that tells us what would be the steps, the procedures, and the activities to be done. But what is more important and oftentimes missing is to make sure that we come up with what we call a standard work, where it defines what to do, when to do it, and who should be doing it. Beyond understanding the concept of standardization, we need now to practice how we can have better standards at work. And to do that, we now pursue what we call standard work. Standard work is the process by which we can practice the setting up, communicating, following, and improving of the standards. Standard work talks about co-creating, clarifying, and sharing information so that people understand that the standards will have to change. Special emphasis on standard work is to make sure that people agree on what is the right practice that's going to be best for the results of the process. This time, when we talk about standardization, it is about building the habits more than having standards. So the way to do this is that we can adopt this concept from Charles Duhigg, where he talks about the power of the habit. And the idea is that you cannot change the bad habit easily, you cannot remove it, but you can somewhat influence it so that without them realizing it, the bad habit becomes a good habit. And what we do is we use the same cue and the same reward, but change the routine in order for them to get used to a new routine in order to give them the same impact or benefit that they would have gotten before this change in habit. In order to make use of these standards, we need to remember that the habit will ensure that these standards will be applied and improve moving forward. To do that, we need the right routines in place. A routine is a way to change the habit, and to make sure the routine is going to be applied, it has to be structured, it has to be deliberate. There has to be a way to promote the routine so people will get used to it. Every time you think about doing something, you need to be able to make sure that they will likely to do it again and again. When we talked about standardization or standardizing work, we first describe it as something that we need to document based on an agreed process, which can be used to further improve our processes later on. But more importantly, when we now use the word standard work, it is about a structure and a routine that will help our leaders and our people be able to shift their attention from just looking at the results to focusing more on the process that is needed to produce the results. It is about knowing what the right behaviors are for the leaders and their people to do the work. By applying the concept of standard work, we expect to have the following benefits. We believe that with standard work, problems can be solved faster, quickly, creatively, and permanently. We promote collaborations between our people and the leaders. We push for making sure that we have continual gains in the process. More importantly, by applying the standard work concept, we are also preparing the next generation of leaders in our processes. Also, by having this standard work, we expect superior results simply because people have the authority to change the standards in order to be able to demonstrate better performances. It is self-perpetuating because we help people to own the process and the process changes and coach them into doing the same thing for others as well. In order to make standard work happen, there are three main components that are often attached to doing standard work. These three components talks about the importance of knowing the pace that the work that has to be done. This is captured by the concept of having a takt time, the beat of the process that is needed in order to deliver the results that you wanted in the time that you wanted. Second, it talks about having what we call a standard work in process, meaning you need to be able to determine the allowable number of work in process in order to ensure flow. We don't want to overburden the inventories or the work inside the process, thereby creating problems later on. And finally, there has to be an agreed order of tasks for each operator in order to understand what is the right sequence of job or task to be done. In essence, when you talk about standard work, it is not equivalent to a manual that everybody needs to read or to open up, but rather a simple set of templates that guides the operators or the people in terms of how to do their job better and faster. These templates are very straightforward and simple. They contain the required pace of work, which talks about the rate by which they produce, It also covers the sequence of the task done by each person and the required flow and inventory that is allowed to stay inside each process. These three concepts becomes the foundation of ensuring that the standard work is done properly. Here's an example of a standard work template whereby on the left shows you the flow of the work to be done and the amount of inventory that is allowed to stay inside that work. On the right side, it describes the sequence by which you should perform the task and the time that is allowed in order to make sure that you complete the entire task or process on time. The concept of standard work can be applied to anyone in our organization. They can be applied to the operators of the process up to the leaders of the organization. In general, when we apply standard work at the operators level, it describes a very detailed set of instructions, timing, including what needs to be done, when and who, in order to make sure that these tasks are done at the right order. As you go to the level of the executives, standard work can be applied, but it can contain a more general set of activities that focuses more on monitoring, supervising, coaching, and guiding our people. As Deming pointed out, there is a warning when we now go and do standard work. In principle, standard work is very beneficial and important because it will help us set the foundation for our experiments. It preserves the gain for us to go into the next level of improvement. However, in practices, standard work can be misused and they become a barrier for improvement, and therefore we need to be aware that certain standard work needs to be changed in order for us to be able to move forward. In order to take advantage of using these standards and applying standard work, it is quite important that the leaders of the organization be able to capitalize and practice the same idea behind standard work. The goal is not only to be able to make sure that the work is done the same way, but to be able to help our people have better habits and in the end can later on lead their team to review and improve these standards. In this lesson, when we talk about leaders' standard work, we are referring to three practices that's quite important to make sure that standards are done or used properly. First, we need to be able to apply what we call daily team reflections, or sometimes called daily stand-up meetings. Leaders should be able to apply or practice what we call Gemba walks, seeing what is actually happening and not relying only on what other people say. And third, and the most important activity of the leader, is to be able to apply and practice mentoring and coaching their teams, their team leads, to be able to review and set further improvements. In order to make sure that the improvements continue to stick in our processes, in our habits, it is important for us to promote what we call a daily stand-up meeting. The real goal of the daily stand-up meeting is really to help the team do what we call a daily team reflection, a retrospective activity that allows us to reflect on how we did something yesterday and how we can do it better today. Daily team reflections or daily stand-up meetings requires us to ask ourselves, our team, in terms of what happened and how we can do it better. Questions like, what did we accomplish last time? How we did it? What were the opportunities or ways that we've seen along the way? What are the things that keeps us or the obstacles that keeps us from doing the things that we need to do? What ideas can we have in order to become better? And what can we work again in the next meeting? These questions are important in order to help the team reflect on themselves and their actions in order to find ways by which becoming better is now a habit. Part of the daily meeting is to be able to reinforce on what we call the accountability process. By having these daily meetings, we get the opportunity to set the direction and the pace by which the team should be able to pursue improvements. It can also help focus on the process or the actions needed in order to improve our output. It's also a good opportunity to make use of our visual management systems or visual controls and our Gemba walks in order to convert the things that we observe into actions of improvement. These daily accountability meetings can come in the form of 3 tiers or 3 levels. The first will be at the level of the operators and the team leader who are responsible for the task or the operations down in our line. A second tier of daily accountability will be with the supervisors and the team leaders, and their focus is talk about what can we do next time. And the third tier will be about the managers and the support services that will talk about how we can plan further from this day to the next week. These different tiers are used or are needed in order to make sure that everything that has to be done at the first level, at the operations level, are supported and aligned to the needed resources of the group. Consistent to our lean perspective or lean thinking, we need to make sure that these meetings do not become waste themselves. These stand-up meetings are rarely beyond 15 minutes. And the reason where they're stand-up is because we want to make sure that we talk about the most important things and be able to move on and do the work we need to do. It's also important that we do it at the place where we are closest to the work and not away. And finally, it's important to go to the needed visual aids that is available in the line where we see what is really happening and not inside an office. When we define the agenda for these daily stand-up meetings, it's important to limit on focusing on the top 3 or 4 metrics that we need to pay attention to. It's important to know what happened versus what we plan to do, what are the gaps that we experience, and ask the question why the gaps exist, what were the obstacles or impediments that hindered us from reaching those numbers, what can we do in order to close these gaps, and what action should be done in what period in order to make sure the gaps are addressed. It's also important that we recognize the people who are instrumental in closing these gaps. The purpose of these accountability meetings is not to put out fires, but to find solutions that will be more sustaining than simply having a quick win. One way to reinforce the accountability of everyone in our processes is to set up what we call a daily accountability board. The board talks about what the role of each person is in the team and what that person should be able to do and accomplish in each period. In relation to our daily accountability meetings, it's important for leaders to be able to practice regular Gemba walk. Gemba walk really refers to being there in the real place. It's about seeing the reality. Gemba is a Japanese term where the goal is to be able to observe, recognize, communicate, solve the problem, cooperate in order to make sure that what is happening, everybody sees. Gemba walks are very valuable for leaders so that they can actually have the insight to see what is really happening, be able to engage the people who are there, gain better knowledge than in the office, and be able to see opportunities for improvement. Taking the two together, Gemba walks and daily reflections help reinforce 2 things. In Gemba walks, we get to expose possible problems or waste by asking questions of why and how things happen. The goal of Gemba walk is not to instruct people what to do, but rather to pose questions of what can be done better. In terms of daily reflection, this becomes the process by which our people in the process will have to reflect on the questions generated during the Gemba walk. They will now think about how they can now go beyond the old standard or practices and go to a new standard in order to find better performances, or perhaps achieve a breakthrough performance. The third important role of leaders in making sure that improvements are sustained is to mentor future leaders. To be able to sustain these improvements, we need to think about how we can continue to reinforce these habits and how future leaders can also help improve or build up on these habits. In order to sustain these improvements for our organization, leaders should now have to rethink their role. Before, when we talk about leaders, leaders often act as supervisors or managers where they tell people what to do. In this new way of making sure improvements stick, leaders and managers should now become coaches of improvements. It's important for us not to talk about what people should do, but be able to help them develop themselves and train them, because how we talk to them and how we say things actually shape how your people think. One way by which we can now develop leaders or the leader practice in our group or in our organization is to apply what we call leader standard work. Leader standard work is simply a list of things that leaders such as the supervisor, the team lead, or the manager has to perform on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And it should talk about how often they should do it and what is needed for them to pay attention to. Going back to your own areas, consider creating your own version of a leader standard work. By having this leader standard work, it reinforces now the importance of having what we call a lean management system in place in your own organization. Creating this leader standard work means that we need to be able to identify together with the leader what activities are critical for the person to do, how often they should do this, who are the people that should be involved, what questions should be asked or will be asked, and what is the reaction of this leader towards the state of our processes. Common failures of having to apply the leader standard work stems from the lack of consistency and discipline that we as leaders also need to apply and practice. It talks about reaching out and identifying real tasks that are important and not only those safe activities that keeps us a sense of we're doing something about it. It is not a calendar that talks about what they do, but rather the key activities that makes their work very important. It is not about having something to do regularly or to just focus on something that's immediate. Having this leader standard work is not a checklist where you just complete your task and you're done. It is a process by which we talk about integrating our daily stand-up meeting with the Gemba walk, our reflection meetings, and the actual visual systems that happens in the line that tells us that there is something else we can do. This leader standard work is a repetitive and predictable cycle of activities that's crucial to making sure that we continuously ask ourselves, can we make the process better and better? An important part of the leader standard work is also to consider how leaders respond to visual signals. A case in point in this illustration, where there is an unknown system where the supervisor or the operator is tasked to do something given a specific activity for a period of time. When such activities are not able to comply or meet, the team leader comes in and is now defined in such a way what the team leader is needed to do when such things happen. Leader standard work helps us also reinforce the importance of being able to do rapid responses when certain things don't happen as we expected. This is where we now integrate what we have learned in our previous lessons on making use of visual signals such as Kanban and Kanban to be able to detect and identify possible abnormalities that leaders should be able to respond and resolve quickly. Finally, in this lesson, we close the entire concept of making sure that our experiments towards improvement is not something that's done by the leader, but through the guidance and coaching of the leader. Lean leadership, or the practice of lean leadership, is about working together with your own team and your own people. Coach them, mentor them to become better in order to identify things that should be done better, moving us closer and closer to our desired future state and helping us accomplish the challenges that we have laid out in front of us. The role of the leader requires us to be able to appreciate and make use of the concepts of lean, such as visual boards, having Gemba walks, doing this problem-solving or experimental approach to improvement, and then reinforcing it further with the right meetings, the team structure that allows people to gain accountability, and the process by which we reflect on the activities that our team will be doing. Some key messages that I'd like you to remember as a way to close our lesson 2 and of course our course 2. First, sustaining improvement means that we need to ensure that standards are clear and well defined. Standard work is the way by which we can make sure that standards remain current and relevant by co-creating it and allowing our people to be part of defining the standard work. And lastly, we as leaders are the driving force to reinforce the culture of improvements by developing other leaders who will now have to carry the torch in building that habit of improvement.